Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the bombshell set that is Jumpstart Historic Horizons, separating the gems from the chaff and pulling out all of the cards that we'll be testing out in our own Arena Unrestricted cube. We're finally getting our hands on some all-time bangers while also adding some of the better cards from both Modern Horizons sets to our cubes for the first time. Note that we're not doing a Peasant Cube update this time around. We've got a big update planned for that, but decided to postpone until the release of Innistrad Midnight Hunt, which is actually only a few weeks away. As always, if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel, and come find our Discord channel in the links below. As of the recording of this video, we're one member away from 300 users in the Jank Diver Gaming Discord. Who knows, that 300th person could be you. Alright, we've got some exciting cards to talk about today, let's get to it. From Vintage Masters to Modern Horizons, our first card is a tried-and-true powerhouse of a token generator. Battle Screech is very often 4 flying bodies for 4 mana, assuming you can tap a white creature you control the turn you cast it. Cards like this are a huge boon for both the Selesnya Tokens decks and the Boros Gold-wide decks, while also serving a pretty important purpose in Orzhov Aristocrats decks. That's a lot of coverage for a card that is also just powerful in isolation. Decks looking to get ahead with 1-for-1 removal are going to have an embarrassing matchup against Battle Screech, and I fully expect this card to close out its fair share of games. As always, we'll be briefly discussing which cards were removed to make room for our new additions. In this case, the cut was Angel of Sanctions. Removing a card doesn't necessarily mean that the card was bad or undesirable, but as with Angel of Sanctions, some cards are powerful but occupy a high enough spot on the curve that they're easily replaced by other options. The Angel pulls its weight well enough, but it's debatable if it's really better than your typical Baneslayer type finisher in decks that want a top-end white creature. Restoration Angel is one of my favorite cards of all time, and we've got a pretty clean and easy swap for Glorious Protector. The Protector, being a callback to Resto in and of itself, has been an interesting addition to the cube and holds its own as a way to protect your board and ambush attackers. As a matter of fact, Glorious Protector is capable of more explosive plays than Restoration Angel, occasionally exiling an entire board of creatures and popping them back out later for multiple ETB triggers. Protector also serves as Wrath Insurance, whereas Resto's specialty is saving a single creature from single target removal. Still, with Glorious Protector's ceiling being a fair bit higher, Restoration Angel's immediate blink-on-demand ability is the desired effect that we want from this slot. It's a classic flicker creature and helps us tie together the blue-white blink deck that we're hoping to support with this update. On a recent episode of our podcast, The Deep Dive, we talked about the potential to hide some human tribal synergies in the white section of our cube, with Thalia's Lieutenant being a key piece that would allow us to do this. The thing is, we're not doing any fancy restructuring of the cube to make human tribal as loud as possible. Rather, our white section is so full of humans already that a card like Thalia's Lieutenant just naturally slots in with the types of cards you'll already be playing in your white aggro decks. Pulling off something like Zombie or Vampire Tribal in a cube like this would require a bit of intentional reworking, but humans are already plentiful, and a couple human payoffs like the Lieutenant can add some flavor and texture to your typical white beatdown deck. It's an easy swap for Leonin Lightscribe, which is a good card that's unfortunately under-supported in this sort of environment. The average white deck is criminally low on instants and sorceries, so in order to maximize a white Magecraft creature like the Lightscribe, you have to pick it early in the draft and intentionally draft around it, which means the Lightscribe is an undesirable pick later in Pack 2 or 3. I promise we're not forcing human tribal here, but our next 3 additions all happen to be humans and stand on their own merits without needing a deck built around them. Sure, Handwear Militia Captain asks that you get 4 or more creatures on board to be anything more than a grizzly bear, but that's not a tall ask to transform it into an oversized beater that spits out 1/1 tokens on each of your end steps. Oh, and those tokens just happen to be humans. See, this is a pretty good creature in a vacuum, but just to drive home my previous point, having a card or two like Thalia's Lieutenant floating around give you some incredibly powerful 1-2 punches without asking you to make any sacrifices for the tribal synergies. Adorn Pouncer got cut to make room. It's a serviceable double striker with some minor graveyard synergy, but it's never been impressive in my estimation, and no deck ever needs an Adorn Pouncer. Blade Splicer was one of the unexpected surprises from the Historic Horizon set, and it's a top-notch card for our cube. I absolutely love bridge creatures like this that pull their weight in a number of different decks. Blade Splicer is going to be great in all of your typical go-wide decks, whether that's Orzhov Sacrifice or Boros Aggro, but it's also a fantastic addition to the blue-white blink deck, and the token matters quite a bit for the green-white tokens decks. That's every white color combination accounted for, which makes Blade Splicer a role player and a top pick for nearly any white deck. Oh, and it's also a human. In just a span of a little over a year, the quality of our white 3-drop section has skyrocketed, with Kinjali Sunwing being the last of the 3s that we're eager to remove. Seriously, between Skyclave Apparition, Redain, Elite Spellbinder, and now Blade Splicer, our 3-drop white creatures are some of the best we could ask for. Doom Traveler was not a necessary addition, but one we felt was worth testing. It's great sacrifice fodder that can also sneak into go-wide aggro decks, and it wears a Bone Splitter as well as the best of them. Tithe Taker is similar enough in function at a higher point in the curve that it felt like a natural swap. Sure, Tithe Taker has some extra hate bear text, but we found the taxation effect to be largely irrelevant or negligible. Turns out, if you're going to tax the opponent on their instance, they can just play at sorcery speed if they want to. You might get extra leverage against counterspells specifically, but even then an extra mana doesn't necessarily shut down the control player's options. Our final white addition is a card that I was actually super excited about for Peasant Cube, but on second glance it looks like a solid addition to the unrestricted environment as well. Barbed Spike is essentially a 2-1 flyer for 2 with the upside of leaving behind a pretty weak piece of equipment. Yeah, the equipment's nothing special, but the initial body is aggressive enough that you can view the equipment it leaves behind as pure upside. We really don't get a lot of 2-power flyers for 2 mana in white, so Barbed Spike feels like it's playing a role that's in short supply. The cut here was Unbreakable Formation, another piece of Wrath Insurance with an alternative mode of pumping your team and going for lethal. It's flexible, but the defensive half of the card falls short, since white decks interested in this sort of effect can't often afford to pass the turn with 3 mana up. The assertive half of the card is decent, but we're already running a number of Anthem effects in the cube which have that sort of board pump covered. Kicking off blue, we're adding Fairy Seer to the ranks of 1-mana blue flyers in the cube. This slot has long been dominated by Spectral Sailor and Pteramander, and to a lesser extent Siren Stormtamer, and we finally found a 1-drop worthy of fitting in with the big boys. Fairy Seer is pretty simple, but an early Scry 2 can help set your game in motion. It's really a challenge of finding something meaningful to do with the 1-1 body after that point, but between cards like Grazilax, Toski, and Sea Dasher Octopus, plus a new ninja we'll talk about in a few moments, there are plenty of ways to take advantage of a small evasive body. We landed on Mu Yanling as a cut, and while some of our drafters like this card, I think it's pretty weak control planeswalker. The ability to shrink a creature without actually eliminating it as a threat rarely stops the opponent from just running over Mu Yanling with their other creatures. I don't believe I've ever seen someone make the 4/4 token either, since decks that run Mu Yanling tend to need the plus ability to hold back attackers. Consider us unimpressed on this one. We've bemoaned our lack of blue 1-mana cantrips in the historic card pool, but it looks like our luck might be changing with the next couple of releases. Historic Horizons is giving us hard evidence, which I like to think of as the control player's Thraben Inspector. An okay blocker with a delayed card draw attached to it for just a single mana seems viable, and it's in the form of a sorcery, which brings us one step closer to being able to play with cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist and Stormwing Entity, cards that thrive in environments full of cheap spells. Curious Obsession actually gets a little better with our focus on bolstering blue tempo decks, but it's had an abysmal play percentage, and the tools have already been there to make the card viable. At higher rarities, you just have less risky ways to draw cards, so it seems like we can afford to lose this piece of the puzzle. We've been playing with our fair share of Mana War imposters, but none hit quite as right as the OG itself. Exclusion Mage does a good enough impression, and Baron was fine but awkward to cast. Funnily enough, Mana War is still to this day the cleanest version of this effect you can ask for from a 3-drop mono blue creature. Being able to interact with your own board as well as the opponent's is a huge upgrade that makes the Jellyfish appealing for both blank decks and tempo decks. Some classics have not stood the test of time, but Mana War certainly has. Our cut was Nadir Kraken, a creature that Chris and I have gone back and forth on for a while. We both think it's good, with Chris weighing in on its power level a bit more heavily than I do. Still, it's a double blue pip 3-drop in an already saturated section of the cube, so it's out for now. There's a world where we see the Kraken again, but we'd probably need to be heavily incentivized to care about card draw or the token generation it provides. Jumpstart was kind enough to give us the majority of the good ninjas in Magic history. They punked out with Fallen Shinobi, probably for good reasons, but we got the second best option with Mist Syndicate Naga. It's actually the only ninja we're testing out for the time being, but it's a good one, potentially carrying a game on its back with the right support. It feels like a perfect tool for the tempo decks we want to support, and it's not half bad with some of the premium blink targets like Mana War and Friends. The other ninjas are on the sidelines for now, but there's a ninja package waiting in the wings if we ever want to try it out. We recently brought in Boon of the Wishgiver to help support the Drakehaven deck we wanted to try out, but having played the deck, it seems apparent that blue is in no shortage of discard or filtering effects, and on second thought, Boon just doesn't feel necessary. Back to the classics, we're picking up the floppy fish itself, Muldrifter. Now, don't crucify me for saying this, but Chris and I speculate that Muldrifter might not live up to its name. Muldrifter has a bit of a pedigree, if you will, and players assume it's great because, well, it's Muldrifter. However, we're talking about a high power level cube where aggro decks are punishing decks that don't play to the board, and neither mode on Muldrifter sounds appealing when you frame it like that. However, in any sort of control or attrition-based matchup, Muldrifter is going to be the same floppy fish everyone loves, with bonus points for slotting into the Blink deck, which, if I might add, sounds sweeter and sweeter with every card we talk about. Entrancing Melody came back with our previous update, and without getting into the unnecessary details, we're reversing that decision and removing it once again. Pact of Negation has been lingering in the background for a while now, and until now we haven't had a compelling reason to play it. However, blue control decks have been getting actively ranched lately, and Pact feels like it has merit against the field. Being able to tap out for a key card like Immorith or Murmuring Mystic and still have interaction in the form of Pact of Negation helps ensure that your game plan goes untouched, even if the upkeep cost is a little steep. I'm a little worried that the Arena client's priority system will make it too obvious that you have Pact of Negation in the early stages of the game, making it easy to play around, but that's a small gripe. I found You Find the Villain's Lair to be quite poor as far as counter magic goes. As a counterspell, it falls short of what we want from our cancel variants, and the card filtering is actually quite bad given that you're down a card when you use the mode. We have better options like Neutralize and Supreme Will that already provide split options between card filtering and counter magic. The last swap for blue should be pretty quick. Thieving Skydivers coming back in as a 2-power flyer for 2 mana. I think I've hammered home our plans to make blue tempo better well enough by now that it doesn't need much more of an explanation, but it is worth noting that our artifacts and equipment are a little bit more streamlined than they were last time we played this card, which does make it a fair bit better. We trimmed Chemister's Insight as a superfluous draw spell. There's been a healthy debate as to whether Chemister's Insight or Hieroglyphic Illumination is better on average, so weigh in if you have a strong opinion, but for now, Insight was the draw spell we're choosing to part ways with. Black didn't get much, but it did get perhaps the best card of the entire bunch, Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Yawg Daddy is everything you want in one, from a free sacrifice outlet to a draw engine to a discard outlet, creature removal, proliferator, you name it, the Yawg Father probably does it. He's pretty much the quintessential aristocrats card and even has protection from humans to top things off. Time will tell if Yawgmoth proves to be a bit too much for the environment, but for now it seems like it'll be a quite powerful card without being too busted. We're happy to remove Eradicator Valkyrie, which we weren't keen on including in the first place. It was intended as a placeholder until Jumpstart delivered a better black 4-drop, and they certainly succeeded with this one. As of late, Black has been getting Doomblade variant after Doomblade variant with actual Doomblade somewhere in the mix, so it's nice to pick up a different form of removal with Bone Shards. It's an upgrade to other Bone Splinters type cards we've already passed on, but what really sells it for us is the option to sacrifice a creature or discard to destroy any creature or planeswalker and for just a single mana. In other words, Bone Shards lets you trade in your least desired resource from among the cards in your hand or the creatures you control for your opponent's best creature or walker. It's technically card disadvantage, but at a huge discount and will often be a tempo positive play. Cast Down has been a staple removal spell until very recently, but with the push towards better removal over the last few years, Cast Down has been outclassed quite handily. Legendary creatures get printed so frequently these days that the range of targets that Cast Down hits just keeps decreasing over time, and it's fallen squarely in the bottom tier of Doomblade variants. Okay, hear me out on this one. Nested Shambler might look like draft filler, and it's not even an entirely new effect for us, but it's different enough from previous versions of this card that we're going to give it a shot. See, most creatures like this are just 1/1s that die into another 1/1 or something similar, but Nested Shambler actually dies into a number of 1/1s equal to its power when it dies. There are plenty of ways to pump its power without jumping through hoops, from simply having Judith on board to suiting up with a Bone Splitter and going to town. Maybe it doesn't pan out, but there's definitely something here that we're eager to try out. On the flip side, Blood for Bones has been a huge disappointment in this particular cube. It's one of the premium reanimation spells for the Peasant cube, but here the reanimation package is just too finicky for this to reliably be worth the setup. Ransack the Lab was a card we were eagerly hoping for, at least up until Warlock class was printed in Forgotten Realms. It seemed like a potential upgrade, if not a perfectly serviceable replacement to Ransack the Lab, but then Jumpstart went and gave us Ransack the Lab anyway, so here we are with both in the list. There will be times where one outshines the other and vice versa, but giving black more cheap ways to fill up the graveyard can never really hurt. Strategic Planning isn't a card we'd ever be excited about, so it's funny to think how much just shifting the effect into a different color changes our judgment of the card. Phyrexian Arena was removed once more to make room. I hate to say it, but Phyrexian Arena is really showing its age. Playing this on turn 3 means that by the start of your 5th turn, it was functionally Sign in Blood, and it's not until 3 triggers that it becomes better than that. That's the best case scenario of having it on turn 3, of course. Draw this later in the game, or when your life total is under pressure, and it looks even worse. That's not to say there aren't games where Phyrexian Arena puts in work, just that there are more reliable options for drawing cards that don't require as much time and setup. We skipped over White in our previous update, not because we didn't think the card was good, but rather that we just didn't have an immediate cut we wanted to make. White's fine as a good beater that usually dies into a 2/2 zombie, and will rarely be much more than that. Sure, it wears equipment quite well, and forcing your opponent into a chump block scenario against this is basically game over, but that's not exactly a play pattern that's exclusive to having a white with a piece of equipment on it. It's coming in now because we've been unhappy with Callous Blood Mage, and we had a slot open for something else. I've heard the arguments in favor of Callous Blood Mage, and I hate to rain on your parade, but it's just a dead average card. Flexibility matters, but if none of the modes are very impactful, then it really doesn't make much of a difference how flexible the card is. As a 2/1 that cantrips or a 2/1 that comes with a 1/1 Pest Buddy, it's exactly fine at best. I don't fault people for playing it, but it never seems like a card that makes my deck look significantly better than had I not picked up the card in the first place. Red isn't the color that necessarily needed the most love this time, but we got some high quality red cards nonetheless, chief among those being Seasoned Pyromancer. We'd love to see more cards like this, grindy red cards that scale into the late game and interact favorably with the graveyard. It's obviously amazing with Drakehaven and Friends, sets up a potent Mizzix Mastery, gives you fodder for your Rakdos Sacrifice decks, and in a generic red deck with no real game plan, it can straight up draw 2 cards if you have an empty hand when it hits the board. There's a lot to love, and it's at the perfect power level for a cube like ours. Not busted, not broken, but powerful and desirable for a number of different decks. We decided to remove Flame Skull despite not having much experience with the card. Admittedly, I wanted to see this card in action first, but it suffers from the problem of competing with some of the more insane 3-drop red creatures we already have. Even in decks that can take advantage of Flame Skull's Pernicious Death trigger, you'd still almost always want to pick up Bone Crusher Giant or Phoenix of Ash. I don't think Flame Skull's bad, maybe just outclassed, and I'd look for any excuse to bring it back in the future. Boy, Dragon's Rage Channeler is a hell of a card, isn't it? It's only been in print for a few months, and it's made waves in every constructed format it's legal in. Now, we're not a constructed format, and that means that Delirium isn't just a free roll, but the card's good enough without the Delirium bonus that we'd probably still play it even if that text wasn't on the card. Turns out that text is on the card, so it's a sweet bonus on an already decent 1-drop, and even if we're not bending over backwards to enable Delirium, having this card in your deck gives you a nice incentive to change up your draft picks to try and maximize the card. It's a significant upgrade to a number of red 1-drops we have in the cube, with Fireblade Charger being the one we decided to cut. We'll be looking at a few more red 1-drops here, so the cuts are more or less arbitrary. Just know that this section of the cube is getting a little bit of a makeover with this update. I suppose since we're on the topic, let's talk about the other red 1-drops we're bringing in. Blazing Rootwall is an innocuous little fella and doesn't look like anything spectacular until you consider A, the amount of discard effects that red has been picking up, and B, the less than stellar 1-drops that we can afford to remove from the section. Without the Madness clause, this wouldn't even be in consideration, but it does make for a nice addition to decks that are heavy on filtering and discard. We're not even trying to enable Madness, the tools are kind of already there, and Rootwall it feels like it has a home here. Dragon Master Outcast was one of the casualties here, and even though it's a card that can technically single-handedly win a game, it feels like more of a sideboard card against decks that are light on interactions. The problem is that, A, Dragon Master Outcast is already kind of a fake 1-drop since you don't normally want to play the card on turn 1, and B, it's a 1/1 that dies to a fart in the wind and has virtually no utility unless you're spamming dragons with it, and that just doesn't happen very often. The final 1-drop here might give us a sour taste in our mouth, but if Wizards is going to insist on giving us digital-only cards, we might as well try out the ones that we find interesting or exciting. Reckless Ringleader is one of the only ones we'll be playing, and honestly, I have no idea how it's going to play out. The Perpetual mechanic is such a new concept that it's hard to imagine how it'll pan out during actual gameplay. Obviously, the dream is to drop this and give your Elder Gargaroth haste and start smashing, but I imagine the times you top deck this with no other cards in your hand and you wish it was literally anything else. It was interesting enough to warrant a test run, and it'll serve to some extent as a litmus test for the cycle of creatures that grant perpetual keywords to cards in your hand. Fanatical Firebrand isn't exactly that bad of a 1-drop, but we did trim it temporarily to try out this new Ringleader card. If it doesn't pan out, it's an easy swap back. Historic Horizons was pretty generous in terms of cards we weren't expecting to get that we got anyway, with Goblin Dark Dwellers being a pleasant surprise from the set. Again, it's another red creature that promotes grindy mid-range gameplay, something that red decks could use more of, and it's a great addition to Izzet Tempo decks looking to either burn the opponent out or keep their blockers off board. 4/4 Menace for 5 isn't half bad either if it comes with a kill spell or discard spell attached to it. It's something different to do with the 5-drop slot in red, and another well-balanced design. Siege Gang Commander has been around since the initial build of this cube, but it's pretty apparent that it's slipping below the curve in terms of power. Just like Goblin Dark Dwellers, it's unique in the 5-drop slot in that it's not just a giant flying dragon looking to swing and end the game, but Siege Gang's clunkiness definitely shows during actual gameplay. Loath as I am to admit it, I think power creep has caught up to this one. Alright, let's talk about some spells next. Fiery Temper has all of the same supporting cast as mentioned with Blazing Rootwalla, while being a color-intensive 3-mana bolt at worst. Maybe it's not quite there in terms of consistency, but I think it'll stand out. It's very similar to Wizard's Lightning in that it's a Lightning Bolt variant that you need to put work into to make it really worthwhile, but it's not too hard to find a way to discard this in red. Notably, Fiery Temper is actually a better Lightning Bolt when its Madness cost is paid, because you're getting the same effect for the same cost, but you're also paying the cost of another spell or ability with the Fiery Temper. Lava Coil was cut to make room since we have some redundant versions of this effect, and we're still keen on limiting the amount of exile effects and graveyard hate that exist in this cube. Static Discharge is, for all intents and purposes, a sorcery speed lightning strike, and hey, that's a fine place to be. It's weird to have one of these catch-em-all style cards in a singleton queue, but the catch here is that Static Discharge puts a counter on itself. So if you ever copy the spell or flash it back with something like, say, Goblin Dark Dwellers or Seagate Stormcaller, you'll actually get 4 damage out of the deal. We're not putting much weight on the charge counter clause, as a baseline lightning strike for 2 is fine as is. Fire Prophecy is fine at interacting early and shaping up your hand, but it suffers notably from not hitting players, and red decks thrive off of the reach that the burn spells provide. That's not to say every red removal spell has to go to face, but we are on the side of wanting most of them to be able to close out the game. I didn't have Sarkhan's Scorn on my radar at all until Chris pointed out that it actually might have some utility as a catch-all removal spell for red decks. Red is absolutely stacked with lightning strikes and shocks, but it sometimes has trouble dealing with a particularly large creature that's sitting on defense. An early Love-Struck Beast can brickwall a whole team of attackers unless you're willing to 2-for-1 yourself to get it out of the way. Sarkhan's Scorn takes a few extra turns to really get going, but it removes a fair number of threats early on, and by turn 6 or later, it should cleanly deal with anything that's getting in the way. It is a bit on the expensive side as far as red removal goes, and it doesn't go to face, thank God, but I still see the potential in what it's bringing to the table here. Claim the Firstborn felt like a reasonable fit for the Rakdos Sacrifice decks, but it seemed, well, bad. Aristocrats decks at higher rarities can operate under their own engines and don't need the steal and sack aspect of the deck that we're so often used to seeing in retail limited sets. Storm's Wrath is back after a very short hiatus, more as a way to fill the gap left by Devil's Play being removed than because we desperately needed Storm's Wrath back. We did notice after our previous update that Storm's Wrath actually had a pretty high win percentage despite feeling like a double-edged sweeper for the decks that want to play it. I still contend that it's a huge notch below the black and white sweepers, but it still gets the job done, if maybe a little less elegantly. Devil's Play is just not particularly interesting. Fireballs are a dime a dozen, and if we really felt like we needed one, we would have plenty to choose from. The appeal of Devil's Play over any other is the Flashback Clause, which is so expensive to cast that it hardly ever comes up. I've seen it end games, but more often, I've seen it kill a creature and linger in the graveyard for the remainder of the game, never to be cast again. In our deep dive podcast episode on green removal and green interaction in Cube, we gushed a little bit about Sky Shroud Ambush and even speculated on whether or not this would become the best fight spell we have access to in Historic Cube. We're not confident yet, but it's easy to see why we might think this. We've been affectionately referring to this card as Doomblade Draw a Card, which would be an absurd card to print, and yet if you pull off the quote-unquote you win the fight stipulation, Doomblade Draw a Card is indeed what you get. There's enough setup involved to bump it down a step or two, of course. You need creatures, your creature has to be bigger than what you want to kill, you're open to all sorts of usual risks associated with fight spells, such as instant speed bounce or removal. Still, the upside is huge, and green could use more quality removal like this. We had to choose between Primal Might and Inscription of Insight as possible cuts, and the Inscription seems like the obvious choice. Primal Might has a much higher upside and plays more proactively, whereas Inscription has always felt like a defensive measure against decks looking to attack your life total. I have fond memories of Springbloom Druid since 2 copies of this bad boy got my horrendous Day 1 5-color sealed pool to a 7-2 finish at Grand Prix Washington, D.C. a couple years back. Sure, it'll help enable the 4 and 5 color decks in R-Cube too, but we're mostly interested in it because it helps bolster the Golgari graveyard decks as well. See, we've shifted focus on that deck more towards the Crucible World spectrum of cards instead of the typical creature reanimation package, and it's felt like a pretty fresh and interesting archetype to have floating around. Springbloom Druid does all of your usual ramping that you come to expect while also spotting a land in the graveyard for any effects that care about it. It won't make the deck tier 1 on its own, but it helps that particular deck while providing a playable that any other ramp deck will still be happy to have. Most of our cuts from the green section are mid-range aggro creatures, starting with Old Growth Troll. This is a beast of a card for a very specific archetype, mono green that is, which just doesn't come together often. Players snap up green ramp and fix in so quickly that it's hard for a player's seat to ever truly want to be mono green. On top of that, most green decks are focused on the low-end ramp and the top-end finishers, so a lot of these green beatdown creatures fall by the wayside except in maybe the most dedicated Gruul beatdown decks. Tireless Provisioner was a personal sleeper hit for me from Modern Horizons 2. It only took one mention of someone comparing this to Lotus Cobra, and I was all in. Lotus Cobra comes down on 2, I know, but Tireless Provisioner is like a Lotus Cobra that not only lets you store up the mana it produces in the form of treasure, but also gives you the option of producing food in the situations that call for it. On top of that, the landfall ability actively plays into the previously mentioned Golgari lands deck. It's maybe not as powerful as some other 3-mana accelerants like Selvala, but comparing creatures to Selvala isn't exactly fair. I tried really hard to make Pelt Collector work in this cube, and it scorned me every time. It needs to be in your opening hand to justify its spot, and it requires a near-perfect curve out to have a real impact on the game. Also, as with Old Growth Troll and Friends, it asks you to build a green beatdown deck, which isn't what most green decks want to be. Good riddance to this one, you will not be missed. Wall of Blossoms is the definition of a speed bump, cantripping and offering a solid roadblock while you set up for the mid to late game. Yes, green decks want their mana dorks on turn 2, but in the absence of a mana accelerant, a decent blocker can buy enough time to get you to your late game plays naturally. Now, we wouldn't normally consider a card like this because there's not a particular deck or archetype it's intended for, but we want green to have some early game option to ward off the aggro decks in the format. I don't expect Wall of Blossoms to be around forever, but we're hoping it can give the occasional green deck some breathing room against the faster decks in the meta. I have a weird soft spot for Werewolf Pack Leader, which is strange considering I never drafted it or even have much experience with the card. I think it's quite powerful, maybe a bit more so than some of the other community members, but despite fighting to keep it around even this long, it's time to admit that it's just out of place here. I don't consider the green casting cost part of the problem. Rather, it's the same issue with Pelt Collector and Friends. The green beatdown decks are just so few and far between that we just don't need to actively support them. The next cut follows a very similar train of thought. Overgrown Battlement will replace Thorn Lieutenant, which is another early green blocker taking the place of a dedicated green beatdown creature. Now, don't get me wrong, Thorn Lieutenant has been decent. It's a great mana sink in the late game, and it's a nuisance against players with single target removal, but it feels like an elf without a home if we're actively removing all of its best friends from the cube. Overgrown Battlement fits the same bill as Wall of Blossoms, but trades in the cantrip for the acceleration that so many green decks need to function. It blocks, it ramps, perhaps not at the same time, but either way it's doing what green decks need to do to compete against aggro decks. I am a bit worried about these O4s not actually punishing attackers though. They might be damage sponges, but they don't actually stop the opponent from attacking, so the opponent will be free to boast their Usher of the Fallen or flip their Legion's Landing, even if they're not getting in damage. I'll keep an eye on this to see if the O4 blockers are truly pulling their weight. At any rate, they're still excellent sacrifice fodder for Natural Order. Or at least they would be if we weren't cutting Natural Order from the cube. Look, Natural Order is capable of doing something in this environment that other decks aren't even close to keeping up with. And I'll be the first to say that it hasn't been utterly dominating or unbeatable, but still, it produces such binary games that it just doesn't make much sense to keep it around. Either you ramp into it on turn 3 and drop Coma or Carnage Tyrant on board, you draw it later in the game and it becomes Craterhoof Behemoth, or it just rots in your hand being next to useless. Win the game or do nothing is not a spectrum of play patterns we look for in cards, and we tend to get rid of these cards when we can. Think Dark Ritual or Sword of Body and Mind. Cards that have two main modes of being virtually useless or frustratingly broken. When we set up drafts, we're asking people to take time out of their night to come play with us, and we want people to interact and have fun. Cards like Natural Order have the potential to just end games immediately and take all of the fun and interaction out of the game, and that's not our intent. As far as a replacement goes, well, let's just say Winding Way is a little bit more tame of a Magic card. It's card draw in green, even if it's a bit finicky to use. It also fills up the graveyard, which I've already mentioned as being useful to a certain subset of green decks. Maybe not the most exciting card out there, but a good fit for the cube. Soulharder is quite literally the glue that will hold together the blue-white blink deck for us. We've got all the tools now, from Ephemerate and Momentary Blink to a large number of top-tier enter-the-battlefield creatures, and now we have a gold payoff to tie it all together. The fact that Soulharder does exactly what the archetype needs it to do while also becoming a potential threat in the process makes it the ideal reward for being in this archetype. Blue-White Blink has previously been more of a flavor addition and a tier 2 deck at best, but it's fun and skill intensive, and I feel like the pieces are finally here to make it a real contender in our format. We'll see how it all shakes out, but needless to say, this is one of the more exciting includes for us. With that, it's worth noting that Azorius is split between a hard control deck and a creature-based blink deck. There are plenty of heavy hitters for Azorius control, so we felt fine dumping Ojutai's command to make room for Soul Herder. This has been one of the weaker commands. It seems like 4-mana counterspells are just in too awkward of a spot to really come out on top in this cube, and the added utility of Ojutai's command hasn't seemed worth the premium of being a gold 4-mana counterspell. Chainer Nightmare Adept is a sweet addition to the set that Wizards pulled from the 2019 Commander decks. I honestly wish they would be a bit more open to giving us Commander exclusive cards on Arena, but there's been some precedent to doing this with cards like Sawtusk Demolisher from one of the previous historic anthologies. As far as Chainer goes, it seems like it has a fragile body, but it's got a versatile set of abilities, serving as a middle ground between a discard outlet and a reanimation engine. There are plenty of small tricks you can pull off with this card, from discarding a card to flashing a Blacklands Paragon on defense, to just discarding a creature you were intending to cast anyway so it'll gain haste when you cast it from the graveyard. Cards like this are the reason we want to heavily limit the amount of graveyard hosers in the environment. They offer unique and interesting play patterns, and we want cards like this to succeed, so punishing them for trying to use the graveyard just doesn't seem necessary. Orcus continues to get dumped on by the community. Perhaps the player base at large has never faced down a 5/3 flyer that occasionally wraths the board or comes with an extra attacker, but people are down on this card. Whatever the reason, it's still the least thematic card in our Rakdos section, and Chainer gels a great deal better with what the color pair wants to be doing. We're not going full Black-White Reanimator here, so maybe Priest of Fell Rites looks a little out of place, but come on, just read the card. You don't have to promote a full-fledged graveyard deck for Priest to be an absolute monster of a value creature. The life loss puts it in check, but Priest is instantly the strongest Reanimator type card we have access to in the historic card pool, even if the Black-White tagline is a bit out of place. Would we have preferred if this was a black-green card? Sure. Are we still going to play this to loop our Lurrus of the Dream Den and occasionally spike an Ulamog into play? Yeah, you bet. It's capable of broken plays, which we'll keep an eye out for, but it's just an excellent value creature that even gives you incidental advantage if it gets milled over due to Unearth Claws. It's good timing too, because not too long ago we begrudgingly added Corpse Knight to the cube. Nothing wrong with Corpse Knight, it's just very similar to a lot of what Orzhov decks already do, and didn't feel like it provided anything new or exciting for the guild. Goblin and Narcomancer is another card that's easy to overlook, but digging a little deeper into the card, it has some pretty absurd upside. Gruul tends to be the one green deck that's not furiously clamoring for mana dorks. It wants a few, but it also wants to get in damage early and often. Goblin and Narcomancer allows you to do both, and the color requirement is stringent enough that most other green decks shouldn't be interested in sniping it from the Gruul player. A Narcomancer is like a mana dork that can still attack and get in damage, and in some cases discounts multiple spells in the same turn. It's basically Sol Ring. I mean, that's an exaggeration, of course, except when it isn't, and it's a Sol Ring that just dealt you 2 damage. I like the idea of Gruul picking up a pseudo-mana dork that still works in the confines of what the color pair wants to be doing. This change really stemmed from a suggestion to remove Klothys from the cube. Klothys is incredibly powerful, one of Gruul's better cards for sure, but its ability to single-handedly eat a graveyard gives it some unwelcome baggage that we just don't want for the time being. It's hard to justify bringing in cards like Chainer and Priest of Fell Rites, while keeping cards like Klothys in the mix, so Klothys is being edged out to give graveyard decks more breathing room. When we made the shift in Golgari towards more land-oriented graveyard interactions over creature reanimation, we kinda glossed over Lotus Field as a potential inclusion. I wouldn't say it's a perfect fit because there are some instances where Lotus Field is quite bad to have in your hand, but it's still an easy include just to see how it performs. No one's missing Crawling Barrens anyway, and already knowing we wanted to remove that card, Lotus Field already had a spot waiting for it. We've got another weird digital-only card on our hands for the next one. Faceless Agent has the Seek ability, which means on ETB, it'll randomly find a creature from your library from amongst the most prevalent creature type in your deck, and put that card in your hand. You don't get to choose, you don't even get to search your library, it just automatically pulls from amongst your most popular creature type and tutors for you. Strange as that is, it actually seems pretty decent. With no intentions or expectations behind playing the card, you're getting a 2-1 for 3 that always draws a creature into your hand. It works quite well in the aforementioned human tribal variant of white, but even without a strong tribal preference, it'll always find something while leaving a body on board. Add to that its synergy in the blue-white blink deck, and I think we've got a strong colorless contender on our hands. Stronger than Cosmos Elixir, at least. Look, I don't actually even think Cosmos Elixir is that bad. It's just forgettable, and there's no one at the draft table saying, man, I really hope I open Cosmos Elixir. Our final addition is yet another mana dork that we can squeeze into our colorless section. The colorless section doesn't look nearly as questionable as it did a year ago, but we're still looking for improvements wherever we can get them. I believe Ornithopter of Paradise will be on the lower end of mana dorks. It's easier to kill than most dorks, and it offers little in terms of offense or defense, but truth be told, you're playing it to ramp, and it does a fine job at that, regardless of what colors you're in. Maybe it'll serve as a nice ramp and fix-in option for non-green decks, since green has better options, although if I'm being honest with myself, our green drafters are still probably grabbing this card like hotcakes. At any rate, Gilded Lotus, which Chris aptly refers to as old and dusty, is another card like Phyrexian Arena that's aged to the point where you can just play better cards. The mana spike you get from Gilded Lotus isn't typically necessary, nor worth the tempo hit you take from paying 5 mana for this. It's always nice that it refunds you 3 of that mana right away, but you can just ramp earlier in the game with more reliable cards, a number of which provide utility outside of just producing mana. Alright, we made it to the end of another big update for the Unrestricted Cube. Jumpstart Historic Horizons brought so much to the table that I'm sure a few cards slipped through the cracks here and there, so let us know in the comments down below if you think we're missing out on something. Note that Chris and I combed the entire set from top to bottom, so if one of the splashier rares or mythics from the set wasn't mentioned here, there's probably a reason for that. Want to know what those reasons are? Well, best place to come chat with us and talk about cube design is in our Discord server, which you can find links to in the description below. Also tune into our podcast, The Deep Dive, for a closer look at some of our design philosophies and thoughts on Historic Cube in general. Alright, thanks for hanging out. I hope to hear from everyone soon. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming. I'll see you all next time.